Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A question at the diner. Have you ever looked at an old diner booth and wondered if it could remember every laugh, every promise, every silent apology, and every dream shared across the table? What if I told you that the strongest part of my marriage was never built during expensive vacations, luxury dinners, or romantic weekends? But inside a small American diner where the coffee was always a little too hot, the pancakes were bigger than the plates, and the waitress already knew our order before we opened the menu? If learning English has ever felt frustrating, if you have started and stopped more times than you can count, or if you believe your English will never sound natural, stay with me until the end of this story. You are about to discover how one ordinary place changed not only my family, but also the way I learned to listen, speak, and truly live in America. My name is David, and this is my story. Every Friday evening, no matter how busy life becomes, my wife looks at me with the same smile and asks the same simple question. Ready for our diner? My answer has never changed. Always. It sounds almost too ordinary to matter. The same road, the same parking lot, the same little bell above the entrance that rings every time someone walks inside, the same booth beside the front window, even the same slice of homemade apple pie that somehow tastes exactly like it did years ago. Most people would probably call that routine boring. They would tell us to try new restaurants, travel farther, or make our lives more exciting. Maybe they are right. Or maybe they have forgotten that happiness often hides inside repetition. Before I tell you why that booth means everything to us, I need to take you back to the first year I lived in the United States. I arrived carrying 2 suitcases, a dictionary, and far more fear than confidence. America looked exactly like the movies until I actually had to talk to real people. The grocery stores were enormous. The highways seemed endless. The weather changed its personality every few months. Autumn painted every tree bright orange. Winter covered the streets with snow that looked magical until I had to scrape ice from my windshield before work. Spring smelled fresh, and summer filled every neighborhood with backyard barbecues and children riding bicycles until sunset. Everything fascinated me, but every conversation reminded me that I was an outsider. I knew English grammar. I had memorized hundreds of vocabulary words. Yet when someone cheerfully asked, "How's it going?" my brain froze as if they had asked me to solve a complicated math problem. While I searched for the perfect sentence, the conversation had already moved on. Have you ever experienced that feeling? You know more English than you can actually use. You understand almost everything, but when it is your turn to speak, your mind suddenly becomes completely empty. That happened to me almost every day. Slowly, I started talking less. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was afraid of making mistakes. Looking back now, I realize that fear was a much bigger obstacle than grammar. Researchers who study language learning have found that our brains remember new words more effectively when they are connected to meaningful emotions and personal experiences rather than isolated memorization. That explains why we can remember a conversation from years ago but forget a vocabulary list we studied yesterday. At that time, I knew nothing about neuroscience. I only knew that every mistake felt enormous. Then something unexpected happened. I met a woman whose patience quietly changed everything. She never corrected every little error. She never rushed my sentences. She simply listened. Sometimes I needed 10 seconds to finish one simple thought, and instead of looking uncomfortable, she smiled as if every word was worth waiting for. One rainy Friday evening she asked, "Would you like to have dinner with me?" I answered in slow, careful English. Yes. I would like that very much. It was not a perfect sentence. It did not need to be. That tiny conversation became the first page of a story that neither of us could imagine. She took me to a small neighborhood diner that had probably looked exactly the same for 30 years. The booths were covered in red vinyl. Old photographs decorated the walls. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with bacon, butter, and warm bread floated through the air. Families laughed together. Elderly couples quietly shared pie. Truck drivers drank coffee before another long journey. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry. For the first time since arriving in America, I stopped feeling like a visitor. I simply felt like another person enjoying dinner on a Friday night. I had no idea that this little diner would become part of our love story, our marriage, our family traditions, and even my English journey. Sometimes the biggest changes in life never announce themselves. They begin with one simple invitation, one quiet conversation, and one ordinary booth that eventually becomes the place where your entire future patiently waits for you. A new life in America. The funny thing about moving to America is that nobody warns you about the quiet moments. People tell you about skyscrapers, road trips, Hollywood, Black Friday, and the American dream. They show you pictures of New York, Los Angeles, and beautiful national parks. But nobody tells you what it feels like to stand in the cereal aisle for 10 minutes because there are more than 200 different choices. Nobody tells you how confusing it feels when a cashier smiles, asks, "How are you doing today?" and starts scanning your groceries before your brain has even decided how to answer. I thought learning English meant passing exams. America quickly taught me that real English lives in coffee shops, grocery stores, neighborhood diners, school parking lots, and short conversations with complete strangers. Every day felt like a new adventure, but every adventure also came with a small test. The first winter surprised me more than anything else. I had seen snow in movies, but movies never show how cold your hands become when you scrape ice off your windshield before sunrise. I remember standing outside my apartment one freezing morning, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life by moving here. Then an elderly neighbor walked over carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Without asking who I was or where I came from, he handed me 1 cup and simply said, "You'll get used to it." That sentence stayed with me for years because he wasn't only talking about the weather. He was talking about America itself. At work, things were not much easier. My coworkers spoke quickly, laughed loudly, and filled every conversation with expressions I had never learned in school. Someone would say, "Hang in there," and I would secretly wonder where exactly I was supposed to hang. Another person would say, "You've got this," and I would spend several seconds trying to understand what this actually meant. Every evening I went home mentally exhausted, not because the work was difficult, but because translating every sentence inside my head felt like running a marathon without ever crossing the finish line. There were days when I wanted to stop speaking altogether. Maybe if you've been learning English for a long time, you know this feeling. Your vocabulary is growing, but your confidence seems to disappear. Scientists who study language acquisition often explain that our brains experience something called cognitive overload when we process unfamiliar sounds, grammar, emotions, and social situations at the same time. That overload makes even simple conversations feel much harder than they actually are. The good news is that repeated exposure in comfortable situations gradually reduces that mental effort until understanding becomes almost automatic. I did not know the scientific term back then, but I slowly discovered the solution without realizing it. It started with ordinary places filled with ordinary people. Every Friday after work, I found myself visiting the same little diner with the woman who had become the brightest part of my new life. Unlike crowded restaurants downtown, nobody seemed to care how fast I spoke there. The waitress smiled every single week and greeted us with exactly the same words. "Good evening. Welcome back." At first, I answered with only 2 words. "Thank you." A few weeks later, I added another sentence. It's nice to be back. Months later, I was asking questions about the daily special, making jokes with the staff, and even talking with other customers waiting for pie. I never noticed my English improving because it happened one conversation at a time. Looking back, that little diner became my unofficial classroom. There were no exams, no grades, and no pressure. There were only real people having real conversations. The beautiful thing about American diner culture is that it welcomes everyone. Construction workers sit beside business executives. College students laugh with retired couples. Families celebrate birthdays while truck drivers enjoy late-night coffee before another long drive across the country. It reminded me that language is not about sounding perfect. Language is about belonging. One evening, while watching snow fall gently outside the diner window, my wife looked at me and asked, "Do you still feel like a stranger here?" I paused for a moment before answering. Then I smiled. "Not when I'm sitting here with you." She reached across the table and quietly held my hand. At that moment, I realized something that changed my life forever. America had not become home because my English was finally perfect. America became home because I had found people who made my imperfect English feel perfectly welcome. And although I didn't know it yet, the greatest chapters of our story were only beginning. Our Friday tradition. If someone had told me years ago that one simple habit would become the strongest foundation of my marriage, I probably would have laughed. How could the same old diner, the same worn-out booth, and the same Friday evening matter so much? It sounded too ordinary to become unforgettable. Yet that is exactly what happened. Long before we had children, before we bought our first home, and before life became filled with deadlines, bills, and responsibilities, my wife looked at me one evening and said, "What if we come back here next Friday?" It was such a simple suggestion that I almost forgot about it. Then the next Friday arrived, and there we were again. The waitress smiled the moment she saw us walking through the door. "Your booth is waiting," she said. We looked at each other and laughed because we had no idea that sentence would become part of our lives for years to come. Week after week, our Friday diner date quietly became something neither of us wanted to miss. We rarely planned exciting conversations. Sometimes we talked about work. Sometimes we discussed grocery shopping. Sometimes we laughed about something our neighbors had done. Other evenings we simply watched people come and go while sharing a slice of pie. Strangely enough, those ordinary conversations became the most valuable ones. Life has a funny way of hiding its greatest treasures inside routines that look completely unremarkable from the outside. Every Friday felt like pressing a small reset button after a busy week. The stress from work stayed outside the diner door. Emails could wait. Laundry could wait. Everything could wait for just 1 hour. The only thing that mattered was the person sitting across the table. One evening I asked my wife why she loved coming back to the same place instead of trying new restaurants around town. She smiled before answering. "Because this place reminds me that we always make time for each other." That answer stayed with me much longer than I expected. Researchers who study healthy relationships often describe the importance of consistent rituals between couples. These simple, repeated experiences create emotional security because our brains begin to associate familiar places with comfort, trust, and connection. It is not the location itself that strengthens a relationship. It is the repeated decision to show up for each other. Looking back, we were building something much stronger than a tradition. We were building trust one Friday at a time. The funniest part was how everyone at the diner slowly became part of our story. The waitress knew exactly how my wife liked her coffee. The cook always waved from the kitchen window whenever he saw us arrive. Even an older gentleman who came every Friday to read the newspaper eventually started greeting us with, "Date night again?" It felt less like visiting a restaurant and more like returning to a neighborhood where everyone quietly celebrated each other's lives. At the same time, something unexpected was happening inside me. My English was changing without me realizing it. During our first visits, I ordered food using only a few careful words. Coffee, please. I'll have pancakes. Thank you. Months later, I found myself chatting with a waitress about the weather, discussing football scores with another customer, and even joking with the cashier while paying the bill. I had stopped translating every sentence inside my head. The conversations were becoming natural because they happened in a place where I felt completely relaxed. Language experts often explain that confidence grows faster when learners practice in low-pressure environments where mistakes are accepted as part of communication. Our little diner became exactly that kind of place. It was never an English classroom, yet it taught me more practical English than many textbooks ever could. More importantly, it taught me that communication is not about using impressive vocabulary. It is about making another person feel heard. One rainy Friday, the electricity suddenly went out across the neighborhood. The diner became almost completely dark except for a few emergency lights. Instead of leaving, everyone stayed. Someone lit a candle. Another customer began telling funny stories. People who had never met before started talking like old friends. We sat there laughing in the dim light while rain tapped softly against the windows.
No televisions, no phones, no distractions.
Just conversations. Driving home that night, my wife quietly reached for my hand and said, "I think we'll remember tonight forever."
She was right.
We still talk about that evening years later. Looking back now, I understand something I could never see at the time. Love rarely grows because of extraordinary moments. It grows because two people continue choosing the ordinary moments together. Every Friday, every shared meal, every slow conversation, every smile across that familiar booth quietly became another chapter in a story that neither of us realized we were writing. And without knowing it, our little tradition was preparing us for challenges much greater than either of us could imagine. Small English, big feelings. The first time my wife told me that my English sounded beautiful, I thought she was joking. I looked around the diner, expecting her to smile and say, "Just kidding." Instead, she simply reached for her coffee, looked out the window, and repeated the sentence. "No, I mean it. Your English sounds beautiful because you never pretend to be someone else." That answer surprised me more than any English lesson ever had. I had spent months believing that fluent English meant speaking fast, using difficult vocabulary, and sounding exactly like a native speaker. Yet there I was, sitting across from the woman I loved, discovering that real communication had very little to do with perfection. It had everything to do with sincerity. That Friday evening became one of the most important moments of my life, although nobody else inside the diner noticed anything unusual. Around us, families laughed over cheeseburgers, teenagers shared milkshakes after basketball practice, and an elderly couple quietly split a slice of cherry pie exactly as they seemed to do every week. Life continued as usual. But inside my mind, something had changed forever. From that day on, our Friday dinners became more than a date night. They became my favorite English classroom. We created a little game without ever calling it a lesson. Every week, we tried to learn 3 new expressions during dinner. Nothing complicated. Nothing from an academic textbook. Just simple phrases that real Americans actually used in everyday conversations. Sometimes she would point at my plate and ask, "How would you describe this meal?" I would think carefully before answering. "The pancakes are fluffy." She smiled. "Perfect." Another Friday she asked, "How was your week?" Instead of saying only it was good, she encouraged me to explain a little more. It was busy, but I learned something new. Week after week, my answers became slightly longer. My pauses became slightly shorter. My confidence quietly grew while I hardly noticed it happening. Looking back now, I realize why those conversations worked so well. Scientists who study language learning have found that the brain remembers information more effectively when emotions are involved. When words are connected to laughter, kindness, curiosity, or meaningful relationships, they become much easier to recall later. That explains why I still remember conversations from those Friday nights even after many years. While I have completely forgotten hundreds of vocabulary words I once memorized for exams, our brains are not designed to collect random lists forever. They are designed to remember stories. My wife understood that naturally, even without reading research papers. She never corrected every mistake I made. If I used the wrong tense or chose an awkward word, she usually responded by repeating my sentence naturally instead of interrupting me. I learned without feeling embarrassed. That small difference changed everything. Confidence grows surprisingly fast when people feel safe enough to make mistakes. One evening, while waiting for our food, the waitress accidentally spilled a little coffee near our table. She immediately apologized several times. Before I even had time to think, I smiled and said, "Don't worry. Accidents happen." My wife looked at me with wide eyes. "That sounded completely natural," she whispered after the waitress walked away. I hadn't planned the sentence. I hadn't translated it in my head. It simply came out. For the first time since arriving in America, English felt less like a foreign language and more like part of my everyday life. Little victories like that became our favorite reason to celebrate. Sometimes we celebrated with an extra slice of apple pie. Sometimes we simply laughed together during the drive home. We never measured progress by test scores or certificates. We measured it by moments. The first joke I understood without asking for an explanation. The first conversation with another customer that lasted more than 5 minutes. The first compliment I received at work because someone said I sounded confident during a meeting. Those moments mattered far more than perfect grammar. They proved that communication is built one conversation at a time. Years later, after our children were old enough to join our Friday tradition, they loved listening to stories about those early dinners. They laughed when I told them how nervous I used to feel ordering pancakes or asking for extra syrup. They could hardly believe their father had once been afraid to speak English at all. My wife always smiled during those stories because she remembered every tiny step along the way. She knew that behind every simple sentence was another small victory over fear. As I looked around the diner that evening, I realized something beautiful. The booth had never taught me English by itself. My wife had never given me formal lessons. The waitress had never known she was helping me practice. Yet together they had created the perfect environment for learning without pressure. Sometimes the greatest teacher is not a classroom. Sometimes it is one patient listener, one warm cup of coffee, one familiar booth, and one simple conversation that reminds you every single week that your voice is already enough exactly as it is. Hard times together. Every love story eventually reaches a chapter that nobody posts on social media. There are no smiling photos, no perfect sunsets, and no inspiring captions. There are only quiet nights, difficult decisions, and the uncomfortable question every couple secretly fears. Are we going to be okay? Ours arrived much sooner than we expected. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if our little Friday tradition survived because our marriage was strong. Or if our marriage became strong because we refused to give up that tradition when everything else seemed to be falling apart. At first, the changes were almost invisible. My company began reducing overtime hours. Small projects disappeared. Conversations around the office became shorter and quieter. People smiled less in the break room. Every Friday afternoon, another desk seemed to become empty. One morning, my manager invited me into his office. He spoke kindly, but his words still felt heavy. Business was slowing down. Everyone needed to prepare for uncertain months ahead. I drove home with both hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. My mind raced through endless questions. What if I lost my job? How would we pay the mortgage? What would happen to the future we had spent years building together? Fear has a strange way of making ordinary problems feel enormous. That evening, my wife immediately noticed something was wrong. She did not ask dozens of questions. She simply said, "Let's go to the diner." Part of me wanted to stay home. Saving money suddenly seemed more important than eating out. She gently smiled and replied, "We can share one meal if we have to. Tonight isn't about dinner." Those words stayed with me. Sometimes the most valuable investment is not financial. Sometimes it is protecting the relationship that will help you survive difficult seasons. When we walked into the diner that night, everything looked exactly the same as always. The bell above the door rang softly. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Families laughed over burgers. Someone dropped a fork and everyone chuckled. It almost felt unfair that the world could continue so normally while my own thoughts felt so chaotic. We slid into our usual booth without saying much. Finally, after several minutes, I whispered, "I'm scared." My wife reached across the table and held my hand exactly as she had done years earlier during our first dates. "I know," she answered. "Me too." That was all.
No dramatic speeches.
No unrealistic promises that everything would magically work out. Just honesty. Looking back, that simple moment may have saved us more than any financial plan ever could. Psychologists often explain that couples who openly acknowledge stress together tend to recover more successfully than couples who pretend everything is fine. Emotional honesty reduces the feeling of facing problems alone. Instead of carrying fear individually, partners begin carrying it together. Without realizing it, that is exactly what we were doing. During the following weeks, life became even more challenging. We canceled vacations. We delayed home improvements. We learned to cook more meals at home and carefully planned every grocery trip. Yet somehow, every Friday evening remained protected. Sometimes we ordered only coffee and shared one slice of pie. Sometimes we split a simple sandwich instead of two separate dinners. The waitress never made us feel uncomfortable. In fact, she quietly began bringing us extra coffee refills without charging for them. One evening she smiled and said, "You two keep coming back." I like that. She had no idea how much those words meant. The diner staff probably thought they were serving regular customers. In reality, they were giving us something much more valuable than food. They were preserving 1 hour each week where fear was not allowed to become the center of our lives. Gradually, our conversations changed. Instead of asking, "What if everything goes wrong?" we started asking, "What can we do this week?" Small questions produce small answers. Update the resume. Apply for another position. Reduce unnecessary expenses. Call a friend about possible opportunities. One tiny action led to another. Researchers who study resilience often describe this as regaining a sense of control. When people focus on manageable actions instead of overwhelming uncertainty, the brain produces less stress and becomes better at solving problems. Looking back now, I can clearly see that we were not defeating our problems all at once. We were simply refusing to let fear have the final word. Months later, when my career finally stabilized and life slowly returned to normal, we sat together in our familiar booth and realized something surprising. We barely remembered the meals we had ordered during those difficult months. We could not remember every bill we worried about or every stressful phone call. But we remembered every Friday we refused to stop showing up for each other. That old diner had witnessed our laughter, our silence, our tears, and our hope. It quietly reminded us that love is never tested during easy seasons. Love reveals its true strength when two people keep choosing the same table, the same conversation, and each other, even when the future feels uncertain. Lessons from American life. One of the biggest surprises about living in America had nothing to do with famous landmarks, giant shopping malls, or endless highways. It came from watching ordinary people live ordinary lives. Before moving here, I imagined that Americans were always busy, always chasing success, always thinking about work. In many ways, that was true. People worked hard. Schedules were full. Calendars filled up weeks in advance. But hidden beneath that fast-moving lifestyle was something I never expected to admire so deeply. Many families protected small traditions with incredible determination. It did not matter whether those traditions were Friday pizza nights, Sunday church breakfasts, Saturday baseball games, or weekly dinners at the same neighborhood diner. Those little rituals were treated like important appointments that could not easily be canceled. At first, I did not understand why. Then life slowly taught me the answer. Every Friday evening, as my wife and I drove toward our favorite diner, we passed hundreds of people doing exactly the same thing in different ways. Some families gathered around picnic tables in local parks. Young couples walked hand in hand through downtown streets. Grandparents waited patiently outside school auditoriums for music performances. Children carried baseball gloves almost bigger than themselves while parents unfolded lawn chairs beside the field. It seemed as if the entire community had quietly agreed on one simple rule. No matter how busy life becomes, make time for the people you love. That lesson changed me far more than I realized at the time. One evening inside the diner, an elderly couple sat only a few booths away from us. They looked to be in their late 70s. The husband slowly helped his wife remove her coat before sitting down. Without looking at the menu, they ordered exactly the same meals they apparently ordered every week. They spoke softly. Sometimes they did not speak at all, yet their silence felt peaceful instead of awkward. As we finished our dinner, the waitress leaned toward us and whispered with a smile, "They've been coming here every Friday for almost 40 years." I could hardly believe it. 40 years. The same diner. The same booth, whenever possible. The same tradition. Driving home that night, I kept thinking about that couple. My wife finally broke the silence. "Do you think we'll still be coming here when we're their age?" I laughed before answering. "Only if they don't replace our booth." She smiled, but then she became serious. "I hope we never stop choosing each other." Those words settled quietly in my heart. Researchers who study long-lasting relationships often explain that emotional security is built through repeated positive experiences rather than occasional grand gestures. A surprise vacation creates wonderful memories, but consistent weekly moments create lasting trust. Our brains naturally begin to associate familiar routines with safety, stability, and belonging. That is one reason children often love bedtime stories told the same way every night. Familiarity creates comfort. Adults are not so different. The more I observed American family life, the more I appreciated another cultural habit. People often respected personal space while remaining surprisingly friendly. Complete strangers smiled when passing each other during morning walks. Neighbors waved while mowing their lawns. Cashiers wished customers a wonderful weekend. These interactions were brief, yet they quietly created a sense of community. During my first months in America, I worried that my English was too imperfect for casual conversations. Eventually, I realized that most people were not judging my grammar at all. They simply appreciated kindness. A smile, eye contact, and a sincere good morning often mattered more than perfect pronunciation. That discovery made everyday English feel much less intimidating. One autumn evening, after colorful leaves had covered the sidewalks like a bright orange carpet, my wife and I arrived at the diner to find our usual booth occupied. For a brief moment, we stood there looking almost disappointed. The waitress noticed immediately and laughed. "Someone beat you to it tonight." She seated us in another booth only a few feet away. At first, it felt strangely unfamiliar. We joked that our Friday night somehow felt different. Then my wife quietly looked across the table and said something I have never forgotten. Maybe it was never about the booth. I looked at her, confused. She smiled warmly. "Home isn't a place. Home is the person sitting across from you." Suddenly the room felt exactly the same as always. The coffee tasted just as good. The conversations around us were just as lively. The laughter sounded just as comforting. She was right. We had spent years believing that our little booth held all our memories, when in reality the memories had always lived inside us. That realization became one of the greatest lessons America ever taught me. Traditions matter. Familiar places matter. Communities matter. But the true magic has never been hidden inside a restaurant, a neighborhood, or even a country. It has always been found in people who continue showing up for one another week after week, season after season, through sunshine, snow, success, and struggle. And although neither of us knew it yet, another beautiful chapter of our story was quietly waiting just around the corner. Raising our children. People often ask me when our Friday diner tradition became a family tradition instead of simply a date night. The answer is surprisingly simple. It happened the first time a tiny pair of sneakers walked through the diner door beside us. Our oldest child could barely say complete sentences, yet somehow the waitress already knew his favorite pancake before he could pronounce the word. That was the moment I realized something extraordinary. Our story was no longer just about two people learning how to build a marriage. It was becoming the story of a family growing together, one Friday evening at a time. Looking back now, I smile because I remember how nervous I was before becoming a father. I worried about everything. Would I be a good parent? Would my children grow up feeling connected to both cultures? Would they appreciate where our family began? And perhaps my biggest question of all, would they ever understand how difficult learning English had once been for me? Life has a funny way of answering our biggest questions through very ordinary moments. One Friday evening, our son climbed onto the booth seat beside me and looked around with wide, curious eyes. "Dad," he whispered, "why does everyone know us here?" I laughed softly before answering. "Because we've been coming here for a long time." He thought about that for a second before asking another question that stayed with me forever. Can we come forever? Children have an amazing ability to turn simple conversations into unforgettable memories. My wife smiled across the table, gently squeezed my hand, and quietly answered before I could. "We'll come as long as this place makes us smile." Years passed, and our family grew. Soon our daughter joined our Friday dinners too. Suddenly the peaceful booth that had once felt spacious became wonderfully crowded. Crayons rolled across the table. Coloring pages covered the menus. Milkshakes replaced coffee on one side of the booth, while extra napkins somehow disappeared every single visit. The quiet conversations my wife and I once shared became joyful interruptions filled with questions that only children could invent. Why are pancakes round? Who made ketchup? Do birds ever get tired of flying? Sometimes we laughed so hard that other families nearby started smiling without even knowing the joke. Those evenings taught me something no parenting book ever could. Children do not remember expensive gifts nearly as clearly as they remember repeated moments of togetherness. Researchers studying child development often explain that predictable family rituals create emotional security, helping children feel safe, connected, and confident as they grow. Weekly traditions become emotional landmarks that children carry into adulthood. Looking back, I can see that happening right before my eyes. Our children never asked for fancy restaurants. They looked forward to Friday because Friday meant family. It meant stories. It meant laughter. It meant everyone putting away phones for one precious hour. As our children entered school, another unexpected surprise appeared. They began helping me instead of the other way around. One evening, my son heard me searching for the right English word during a conversation with another customer. Before I could finish the sentence, he quietly whispered the word into my ear with a proud smile. We both laughed. "Looks like you're my teacher now," I said. He grinned so proudly that I still remember the expression today. That tiny moment reminded me how far our journey had come. Years earlier, I had been terrified of speaking English. Now my children were growing up, naturally switching between conversations, never realizing how much courage every sentence had once required for their father. At home, we created another tradition inspired by those Friday dinners. Every Sunday evening, each family member shared one good thing that had happened during the week. Some stories were funny. Others were surprisingly thoughtful. Sometimes the children talked about helping a classmate. Sometimes my wife described a kind customer at work. Sometimes I simply shared a new English expression I had learned. These conversations were never long, but they quietly taught our children that listening was just as important as speaking. Scientists often describe active listening as one of the strongest predictors of healthy family relationships because people naturally feel valued when they know someone is genuinely paying attention. Our little family practiced that skill without realizing we were practicing anything at all. One snowy December evening, as Christmas lights reflected softly across the diner windows, our daughter looked around the busy restaurant and asked, "Dad, do you think this diner will always be here?" I paused before answering because, honestly, I did not know. Buildings change. Businesses close. Neighborhoods grow older. Nothing lasts forever. Then I looked around our booth. My wife smiled exactly as she had years ago during our first date. Our son laughed at something his sister had said. Warm coffee filled the air with its familiar aroma. In that quiet moment, I finally understood the real answer. "Maybe not," I told her gently. "But the love we built here will always stay with us." She nodded, completely satisfied with that answer, and reached for another bite of pancake. As I watched my family laughing together beneath the warm diner lights, I realized our Friday tradition had become something much greater than a weekly dinner. It had quietly become the heartbeat of our family, teaching our children that love is not measured by extraordinary moments, but by the simple decision to keep coming back to the people who matter most, week after week, year after year. Science behind simple habits. What if I told you that the strongest part of our marriage was never romance, luck, or even compatibility? What if the real secret was something so ordinary that most people overlook it every single week? It wasn't an expensive anniversary trip. It wasn't a perfect relationship without arguments. It wasn't even our favorite booth at the diner. The real secret was repetition. The same Friday. The same promise. The same decision to show up, even when we were tired, busy, stressed, or simply not in the mood. Looking back now, I realized that our weekly diner dates were quietly changing our brains long before they changed our lives. At the time, we thought we were just eating dinner together. Years later, I discovered that science had been sitting beside us the whole time. Researchers in psychology and neuroscience have spent decades studying habits, relationships, and emotional well-being. One conclusion appears again and again. Small, positive routines repeated consistently create stronger emotional bonds than occasional grand gestures. That surprised me because most movies tell the opposite story. They celebrate dramatic proposals, expensive vacations, and unforgettable surprises. Those moments are beautiful, but they are rare. Real life happens between those highlights. Real love grows while paying bills, washing dishes, helping children with homework, and sitting across from someone over 2 cups of coffee after a long week. Our brains love predictability far more than we realize. When a familiar experience is repeated in a safe environment, the brain begins to associate that place, those people, and those conversations with comfort instead of stress. Every Friday, before we even opened the diner door, I could already hear the little bell above the entrance, smell fresh coffee drifting through the air, and picture our favorite booth waiting by the window. Almost immediately, I felt my shoulders relax. Work stayed outside. Deadlines stayed outside. Worries waited in the parking lot. That small ritual quietly told my mind, "You're safe now." Looking back, I understand why our conversations always seemed easier there. My brain was no longer fighting stress. It was ready to connect. The same thing happened with my English. In the beginning, every sentence felt like climbing a steep hill. I worried about pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and making embarrassing mistakes. But because those conversations happened every single week in the same welcoming place, something remarkable occurred. My fear slowly disappeared without me noticing. Scientists explain that repeated exposure to low-pressure situations gradually weakens anxiety while strengthening confidence. In other words, the brain learns that nothing bad happens when you speak imperfectly. Eventually, speaking becomes natural because fear is no longer controlling the conversation. That perfectly describes my experience. I never woke up one morning suddenly fluent. Instead, one Friday I realized I had just finished an entire conversation with another customer without translating every word inside my head. It felt almost magical, although the change had actually been happening little by little for years. My wife noticed it before I did. She smiled one evening and quietly said, "You're thinking in English now." I laughed because I hadn't realized she was right. We often imagine progress as something dramatic, but real progress usually whispers instead of shouting. Raising our children taught us another fascinating lesson about habits. Every Friday, they knew exactly what to expect. The same drive. The same waitress greeting us with a smile. The same booth whenever it was available. The same laughter filling the restaurant. Those repeated experiences became emotional anchors in their childhood. Family psychologists often explain that predictable traditions help children develop a stronger sense of security because they know there will always be moments when everyone comes together, regardless of how busy life becomes. Watching our children laugh around that familiar table convinced me that routines are never boring when they are filled with love. They become memories in slow motion. One evening, after dinner, our son asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Dad, when I'm grown up, do you think I'll bring my own family here?" I looked across the table at my wife. Neither of us answered immediately. We simply smiled because we realized something extraordinary. Our tradition was becoming bigger than us. It was quietly reaching into the next generation. Maybe that is how love survives through time. Not through perfect moments, but through simple habits repeated so often that they become part of a family's identity. As we walked out into the cool evening air, the familiar bell above the diner door rang softly behind us. I turned back for just a second and looked through the front window. Another young couple had just sat down in our favorite booth. They were laughing, talking slowly, and looking at each other the same way my wife and I once had years ago. I smiled because I suddenly understood something beautiful. The booth never creates the love. The people do. The habit simply gives love a place to return every single week until one ordinary tradition quietly becomes the greatest story a family will ever
Tell.
Love still sits there. Have you ever returned to a place after many years and felt as if time had decided to wait for you? That is exactly what happened one cool Friday evening when my wife and I pulled into the familiar parking lot of our little neighborhood diner. So much had changed since our very first date. Our hair carried a few more shades of gray. Our children were no longer asking for crayons and chocolate milk. One was preparing for college, and the other had already started talking about future dreams that suddenly made childhood seem very far away. Life had moved forward exactly as it was supposed to, yet something inside me wondered whether our old diner would still feel the same. As we opened the door, the tiny bell above the entrance rang with the same cheerful sound I had heard hundreds of times before. For just a second, it felt as though every Friday evening from the past had quietly returned at once. The smell of fresh coffee still floated through the air. The grill still sizzled behind the counter. The walls still displayed faded photographs of local baseball teams, smiling families, and neighborhood celebrations that stretched back decades. Some things had changed, of course. A younger waitress greeted customers where our longtime waitress had once stood. The menu had added healthier choices. The booths had been reupholstered, replacing the cracked red vinyl we remembered so well. Yet despite all those changes, something invisible remained exactly the same. It was the feeling that this little place still welcomed anyone carrying a story. As we stood waiting to be seated, the young hostess smiled warmly and asked, "Would you like your usual booth by the window?" I looked at my wife with complete surprise.
How does she know?
I whispered. Before either of us could ask, the hostess laughed softly. "Our manager told us about you. He said there's a couple who has been coming here almost every Friday for years. He told us to take good care of you whenever you visit." I honestly didn't know what to say. We had never imagined that our quiet tradition had become part of someone else's story too. We slid into the familiar booth, and for a few moments neither of us spoke. Instead, we simply looked around, noticing tiny details we had once taken for granted. There was the corner where our son had accidentally dropped an entire glass of orange juice when he was 5. There was the counter where our daughter proudly ordered breakfast by herself for the very first time. There was the window where my wife and I had watched snow gently fall during one of the hardest winters of our lives. Every corner seemed to hold a memory waiting patiently to be remembered. Scientists who study autobiographical memory explain that familiar places often trigger vivid emotional recollections because the brain stores experiences together with sights, sounds, smells, and physical surroundings. That may explain why one simple cup of coffee can suddenly remind someone of an entire chapter of life. Sitting there, I realized I was not just remembering events. I was remembering who we had been during each season of our journey. We ordered almost the same meal we had enjoyed on our first date years earlier.
Pancakes for me.
Eggs and toast for my wife. Coffee for both of us. As we waited, she smiled across the table and asked, "If you could tell your younger self one thing before that first dinner here, what would it be?" I thought about the nervous young man who had been afraid to speak English, worried about fitting into a new country, and uncertain whether he deserved the future he dreamed about. Finally, I smiled and answered, "Stop worrying about sounding perfect. The people who truly love you are listening to your heart, not grading your grammar." She laughed gently before adding, "I think he'd be very relieved to hear that." We both smiled because we knew it was true. Looking around the diner, I noticed young couples sitting where we had once sat, laughing over milkshakes, sharing fries, and talking about dreams they had not yet lived. I wondered if they realized they were quietly building memories that would one day feel priceless. Perhaps they believed they were simply having dinner. We had believed the same thing once. Life has a beautiful way of disguising extraordinary moments as completely ordinary evenings. Before leaving, I walked toward the front counter to pay the bill. The manager recognized my name immediately and smiled. "Thank you for keeping your tradition alive," he said. "Places like this only stay special because people keep bringing love through the front door." During the drive home, those words stayed with me. I looked at my wife, who was quietly watching the sunset through the passenger window, and suddenly understood something I had never fully realized before. Our love had never belonged to that diner. It had simply grown there, week after week, conversation after conversation, until it became strong enough to travel with us, wherever life decided to lead. And somehow, every time we returned, it still felt as though our love was patiently waiting in that little booth by the window, smiling exactly the way it had on the very first Friday night. Your story starts today. What if, after listening to this story, you discovered that the most important chapter was never mine at all? What if it was yours, waiting quietly to begin the moment this video ends? Maybe you have spent years believing that your English is not good enough. Maybe you are waiting until your pronunciation becomes perfect before speaking. Maybe you tell yourself that one more course, one more textbook, or one more grammar lesson will finally give you the confidence you have been searching for. I used to believe exactly the same thing. Looking back now, I can honestly tell you that confidence never arrived before I started speaking. Confidence arrived because I kept speaking one slow conversation after another. That old American diner never asked me to sound like a native speaker. My wife never expected perfect grammar. My children never cared whether I used every verb correctly. They only wanted me to be present. Somewhere along the journey, I stopped trying to impress people with English and started using English to connect with people. That small change transformed everything. Today, when I think about those Friday evenings, I rarely remember the food we ordered. I don't remember every conversation word for word. I certainly don't remember every grammar mistake I made. What I remember are feelings. I remember walking through the front door and hearing the familiar bell above it. I remember seeing my wife smile from across the booth after another long week. I remember my son proudly ordering breakfast by himself for the first time. I remember my daughter laughing so hard that everyone around us started smiling too. Those are the moments that remained. Scientists who study long-term memory have found that emotional experiences are stored far more deeply than isolated facts. That explains why we forget hundreds of ordinary days, but clearly remember one meaningful conversation from years ago. Language learning works much the same way. If you connect English with real stories, meaningful relationships, and positive emotions, your brain naturally holds onto those words much longer. That is why I chose to share this story with you instead of giving you another vocabulary list. Stories stay with us because they make us feel something. Perhaps you have noticed that the English throughout this journey has remained simple, slow, and natural. That was intentional. Real communication is rarely filled with difficult words. Most conversations in everyday American life are built with simple sentences spoken sincerely. You do not need extraordinary vocabulary to build extraordinary relationships. A few honest words spoken with kindness can change an entire life. Mine certainly did. If someone had told the younger version of me that one ordinary diner would become the center of my marriage, the classroom where my English would quietly improve, the place where my children would grow up making memories, and the symbol of a life I once thought impossible, I would never have believed it. Yet life often hides its greatest miracles inside ordinary routines. Success rarely arrives with fireworks. More often, It walks through the front door wearing comfortable shoes, carrying a warm cup of coffee, and asking, "Will you come back again next Friday?" As I look back over everything we have lived together, I realize that our story was never really about a diner. It was about choosing each other again and again. It was about believing that small moments deserve our full attention. It was about discovering that learning a language is not simply collecting words. It is collecting conversations. It is collecting smiles. It is collecting memories that become part of who we are. Maybe your own story will begin in a coffee shop, a local library, a neighborhood park, or at your own kitchen table. The place itself does not matter nearly as much as your willingness to begin. Read one page in English. Listen to one simple story. Speak one honest sentence. Repeat tomorrow. Then repeat next week. One day you will look back, just as I have, and realize that the little habit you almost ignored quietly changed your entire life. Before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with one final thought. Do not wait for perfect English before you start living your story. Live your story first, and let English grow naturally along the way. Years from now, someone may ask you how you became confident, how your family stayed close, or how you finally learned to enjoy speaking English. You may smile, just as I do now, and answer with a simple sentence. It all started with one ordinary conversation. Thank you for spending this journey with me. I truly hope this story has encouraged you not only to practice your English, but also to believe that the smallest traditions can create the strongest relationships and the happiest memories. Your next chapter is waiting, and perhaps it begins today. That's all for today. I'll create many more stories like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.